Hi, everyone. I'm Ed Patuto. I'm Director of Audience Engagement here at the Broad Museum, and I want to welcome you all to the Unprivate Collection with David Salle and Hilton Als. Before I introduce tonight's program, I want to acknowledge the founders and visionaries behind the Broad Museum as well as the Broad Collections who are with us here tonight, Edie and Eli Broad. Thank you very much for this gift. I also wanted to thank Brady Doty of Scarsdale Gallery, who is here tonight with us, and thank her for all of her hard work to make this happen. The Broad launched the Unprivate Collection series in September of 2013, well before the museum opened, and we wanted to present public conversations with cultural leaders and influential artists in the Broad collection. And tonight's program is featuring two extraordinary cultural figures. They'll be discussing David Salle's new book, How to See, Looking, Talking, and Thinking About Art. When this opportunity to have Hilton and David together on stage came up, we jumped on it. Salle's book examines the creative practice and artwork of many artists featured in the Broad collection, including Christopher Wool, Albert Olin, Roy Lichtenstein, Jeff Koons, John Baldessari, Urs Fischer, Jack Goldstein, and Thomas Houseago. And he does so from the vantage point of a practicing artist and peer, which is rare in contemporary art criticism today. You'll have an opportunity to purchase a copy of the book, How to See, some of you have done so already, and to have David sign it immediately following our program outside. As a painter, David has taken the device of pastiche and made it both form and content of his work. His canvases are populated with dramatic images lifted from sources as various as Salle's own black and white photographs, French 18th through 20th century and American painting, 1950s print advertising, and how to draw manuals. The juxtaposition of these images gives his painting a mystery and charge that has intrigued the art world, and in the 1980s made him a leading artist of what we now call the return to painting. And that return to painting still continues today, and you can see it well represented, I think, within the Broad collection and the many painters we have on view. Salle's paintings are in the permanent collection of MoMA, the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the Metropolitan Museum, the National Gallery, LACMA, and the Tate Modern, and virtually every contemporary art museum in the world. The Broad collection includes 14 paintings by Salle. Hilton Als became a staff writer at The New Yorker in 1996, a theater critic in 2002, and a chief theater critic in 2013. His first book, The Women, A Meditation on Gender, Race, and Personal Identity, was published in 1996 and is a moving account of the women in his life. His most recent book, White Girls, discusses various narratives around race and gender and was nominated for a 2013 National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. In 2014, he penned the catalog essay for Robert Gober, The Heart is Not a Metaphor, at MoMA in New York. And Hilton has also written many articles for The Nation, The Believer, the New York Review of Books, and also collaborated on film scripts for Swoon and for Looking for Langston. As an educator, Als has taught at Wesleyan, Wellesley, Smith, and the Yale School of Drama. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hilton, who is going to say a few words and then begin the conversation with David. And thank you again for coming out to this evening's program.
And should I stand there? Or can you hear me with this thing on? Okay. Oh, good. I don't have to move anymore. I'm going to read a little something to you. Good evening. In 1991, the writer George W.S. Trow provided the text for a show of paintings by David Salle. In the catalog, Trow wrote, "The magnet moves underneath the pattern of American life. I think of a surface on which there are things made of different alloys. Some pieces are pure metal. You move the magnet 3 inches, and the pure metal pieces move 3 inches automatically. You also have pieces which you don't move at all when the magnet moves, because they are made of some kind of space-age material. We are like that. We stay still as the magnet moves. When we move, it's because we move, not because the magnet is moving." What interests me about Trow's remarks especially is the idea and reality of movement, thought as movement, making as movement, reflection and action as that which makes up so much of our day-to-day reality, all those moments in which you are you and I am I. And I think, too, that Trow was correct to specify this movement as a distinctly American occurrence, given the restlessness of the country. Indeed, America is a nation built on ever-shifting perceptions and power structures and individualities that get abused and vanquished, too. And when you think about it, history hasn't happened here in America for a long time. It's still new to the rest of the world, and the most definitive recorders and thinkers, indeed movement makers, have been her artists. David Salle has been one of the country's more interesting, troubling, imaginative, energetic, and complex creators for many years now. And in a way, his description of Frank Stella in his piece, Frank Stella at the Whitney, describes something of the spirit one finds in David Salle's work. I quote, "No other artist more completely embodied the expansive optimism, as well as the complexities and contradictions of our American pragmatism. Seeing the breadth and diversity of Stella's inventiveness is exhilarating, but also a little unsettling. It's the story of someone marching to his own beat, come hell or high water." And now, with the publication of his book, How to See, the first of his collection of essays on art and literature produced over a number of decades, Salle established himself as that rare thing, an author with a voice, a restless, emotional, clear-eyed, American-sounding voice. Salle is American down to his bones, born in Oklahoma, and then he was a student at Cal Arts, and then he moved to New York, where, as a young painter, he wrote criticism to subsidize his work, but also it was a way of charting the movement of his mind, I think, which has always been characterized by another equally rare thing, bravery, which is what it takes to do the kind of work David Salle does on and off the page. Ladies and gentlemen, David Salle.
Thank you, Hilton.
Well, you've been on a little bit of a tour.
A little bit.
Talking about writing. And I just wanted to say that from the first minute that I read the book and then reread it again, it had such a profound effect on me because it was so filled with love. Not only a love of painting and artists, but the miracle of actually making things, how things come into being or how you imagine they might come into being. Can you tell me a little bit about where that love comes from, and was there anything in your milieu growing up that suggested that art was a kind of salvation?
I'm not sure where it comes from, Hilton. I'm not sure where it comes from in terms of my biography, but I think that when you cast your lot in this world in this way, you come to realize that how we talk about art matters. How we talk about how these things have come to mean something to us, the language that we use, the vocabulary, and the construction around that actually matters because it helps to define what kind of community this art world, this art life is going to be, what it's going to feel like. I'm not sure it has much to do with my Midwest upbringing, but it has a lot to do with just having gone to school where I did and being a young artist in New York and feeling that there's a long continuity that one ideally is part of.
Were you growing up in what part of Oklahoma?
Well, I was born in Oklahoma, but I actually grew up in Kansas.
And what part of Kansas?
Wichita, which is a city known for airplanes
Yes.
and other things, and Wyatt Earp.
And was there a great deal of reading on your part growing up there?
I think I read the usual stuff that adolescents read at the time. My reading was, I'm not really educated, it's all catch as catch can, really. But I had some very good tutors isn't quite the right word, very good influencers who directed me in certain ways to read certain things.
There were, meaning teachers that were recognized?
Not even teachers, really just people in the world, friends, people who were writers, who turned me on to things which I wouldn't have known about otherwise.
And were you always that sort of kid that was always sort of drawing or imagining things, or no?
I have to admit that I was.
Tell me about the idea of becoming this person who is known as an artist. I mean, it's a sort of, as you say, there's a continuum, and there's a continuity that goes on when one says that for oneself, and then goes out into the larger world to explore ideas and rhythms and so on about one's own work. Did you feel, or do you feel connected to a history?
Well, it sounds a little grand to say so, but yes.
But it's a grand enterprise.
Yeah, when I first came to New York in the mid-'70s, I became friends with a group of older painters who were themselves connected to a much earlier generation of painters whose habits of interaction were quite different from what we think of today. And I remember going to some bars where people were arguing about their work and overhearing the most awful things people said to each other, to their face, to people's faces. I remember being in a bar where one painter said to another painter, "I'm tired of the feeling of hot air coming out from behind your work all the time." It was a kind of a revelation for me. I didn't realize you could even have those thoughts, let alone voice them. So you very quickly realize that there's a big investment in what it is to be an artist. And that big investment is what engenders the strong, passionate feelings.
I think that Tro was metaphorically trying to express something about your work in that introduction that I quoted from, which was the American strain to restlessness and trying different things about movement and thought. I just want to go back a little bit to Cal Arts and ask you about that education, and were you trying all sorts of different forms, film, photography, painting?
Yeah, I did all the...
Because there's a wonderful book of your photographs that I think should...
Thank you. I did all the profligate things that one does in art school.
Yes.
Because why not? And that's why you're there. And it was great fun. not sure how much any of it really meant, but one went through the process of having these experiences. The thing about George Tro, and I'm glad you introduced the evening with a quote from George. He was, I don't know if you all know who he was a great writer about the American, what would you call it, the American scene, the American character. His great theme was wonder and how that stood in relationship to the American psyche. He wasn't particularly a writer about art, about visual art. He was really a man of the theater. But he had a very original conception of American history, which I've in part taken as one of the themes of the book. And George analyzed what happened in American life from the Eisenhower era to the 80s, and expressed it in this phrase. He said it was what we're living under is the collapse of the dominant culture.
Yes.
That we're all living, in a sense, in the wake of the collapsing dominance.
Yes.
Which is something I've used as a marker in some of the essays, because the time in which I sort of came of age, so to speak, was exactly like that. The formalist lock, the formalist hold on imagination that people had worked under, lived under, believed in for 60, 70, 80 years or more, was coming to an end.
Yes.
And of course, like anytime there's a major cultural shift, it doesn't end all at once, or it doesn't end cleanly, or
it's not even particularly perceptible at first.
Exactly.
Right.
Some people are aware of it, some people aren't aware of it, some people struggle against it, but by and large, more or less everyone I write about in the book, and this is something that became apparent only in retrospect, it wasn't something I set out to do, I feel in their own way was responding to the collapsing dominant. Because okay, then what do you do? If there is no hold on imagination, that art has to be a certain way, then you have to find your own inner necessity.
Well, it's a particular sign, or what I call the high style of American genius, which is they really don't know what they're doing, except putting one foot in front of the other, with a certain kind of Puritan-informed grit and energy. And so when I was rereading your book, George came to mind, and I'm so glad that it wasn't inaccurate to ask him to be part of this conversation today. Especially, there's a wonderful Joan Didion quote where she says the act of writing involves the mortal humiliation of seeing your words in print. So I hope it's not humiliating to hear me read your words this afternoon.
I'll let you know.
Okay, later. There's this, David has written a wonderful piece here called Frederick Tootin, The Art of Appropriation. And I'm going to skip around and read the first couple of pages. David writes, "When I was very small, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, I saw on the black and white television in the living room of our house an episode of the Ted Mack Amateur Hour. In this particular episode, a young woman came on stage and sang a wonderful song called I'm Gonna Wash That Man Right Out of My Hair. Everything about her performance was a powerful lesson in charm. I remember being impressed by what was to me the striking originality of the song and the way it was staged. Throughout the song, the young woman was washing her hair, not just miming it, but actually washing it in the basin of water. I just couldn't believe how witty we had become. To my child's mind, this congruence of singing and hair washing was a stroke of theatrical brilliance. It was, quote unquote, representation of an order I had not imagined before. When the woman finished the washing, she took the towel from the stool and dried her hair with it, just as she would do in her own home, finally wrapping the towel around her head to make a turban the way women did in ads I had seen in magazines. The thing was, I had no idea that her song came from the popular Broadway show South Pacific. I was, after all, just a small child in the Midwest. I didn't know there were things called shows and had never heard or seen one. Certainly I had never heard the words South Pacifics or the names Rodgers and Hammerstein or the names of any other Broadway composers or lyricists. I thought the young woman had written the song herself, that it reflected her own problems in the love department, and that she had by herself devised a very winning bit of stage business used to sell the reality of the song. I was certain she would win the week's prize from the Ted Mack people. I'm not sure, but I think it has something to do with appropriation. More than 50 years later, this theme has come into sharper focus. There is a certain history. Without really meaning to, I seem to have made a career out of it myself, and if nothing else, have succeeded in irritating a lot of people. The late Veronica Gang, a writer who practiced the art of literary ventriloquism at a sublime level, related what a critic once told her about me. Salle's work is like a car where they take out the engine, but it runs anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
That's a good line.
pretty good. Pretty good piece, too. Explain.
Well, that's an introduction to the work of the novelist Frederick Tudden, whose first novel that was actually, it was an introduction to a marathon reading of the book out loud. His first novel is the cut-up technique. It's a cut and paste work made in part, not entirely, but in part from segments excised from the work of other writers, Thomas Mann, for example. But it amused me at the time when I found a quote from none other than James Joyce, who said that he was content to go down in history as a scissors and paste man. There was so much loose talk about appropriation, what it meant, what it signified in terms of a political attitude, that I felt, for some reason, it was incumbent on me to bring it down to a child level, because in a way it is the child mind at work, the kind of idea of replication and mimesis, things like that.
You mean sort of wanting to recreate the feeling that you had watching someone perform in that way, or?
There's a literal mindedness to it which is interesting and has led to a lot of interesting work, obviously. But I think it has at its root some kind of childlike relationship to the world, if that makes any sense.
Yes, and it's very difficult to retain that. The more you do.
I'm not sure it wants to be retained.
I wanted to know a bit, there's a wonderful introduction to the book about your life as a writer, and for those of us in the audience who haven't read the book, I wanted to ask you a bit about your first days with that wonderful editor who taught you the glory of not being edited for a while.
Well, it's true, when I first started writing criticism, I really did it just as a way of paying the rent, which was kind of a tradition in its own right. In the New York art world, you could write a few reviews for an art magazine, paid $30 or $40. Rents were cheap in those days, and you could sort of get by doing that and cobbling together a few other survival jobs. So it really was a very kind of lazy person's way of paying the rent without having to do much. There was a magazine.
How many pieces would you have to do to cover the month?
Three or four short reviews. There was a magazine called Arts Magazine, which I think was the same magazine that Don Judd had written for a few decades before that. It was a very loosely edited journal, to put it charitably. Pretty much whatever you wrote got printed. But it was, and I certainly wouldn't want to read those things again, but it was an introduction to the practice of making the rounds and having an opinion about something, which you then would write up and then turning in your copy on time. So sort of getting in the habit of being a working reviewer.
Well, we won't call him the editor then. So we say, who was the spectator?
Well, the magazine was edited by a wonderful man named Richard Martin, who
Yes.
later became a
He was at FIT. Yeah?
curator at FIT, did some
Yes.
great shows at FIT. And he was wonderful. He was very generous. I was a kid, essentially, and he hired me to do whatever.
Yeah.
But then there was a long hiatus in between that job, or that gig, it wasn't really a job, and then becoming a columnist for Town and Country, which even just saying that phrase has a kind of perverse ring to it. But that's, in fact, what happened.
Well, can you describe, build a little bridge between Richard and Town and Country for us?
Well,
As it were.
what's that device in movies? The pages of the calendar
Yes,
fly
exactly.
off.
Autumn leaves fly by.
A few decades later,
Yeah.
a friend of mine in New York, the poet Frederick Seidel, who's a kind of eminence grise in the literary world in New York, had been encouraging me for some time to do some writing. And I said, yeah, that would be nice if one had time to do it. And then, I think without my really knowing it, he called a friend of his, a woman named Gemma Seif, who was the culture editor at Town and Country, and it sort of pitched the idea to her without my being involved. I got a call from Gemma saying, why don't you come up to the office and meet people? I did, really out of curiosity. I went up to the Hearst building on 57th Street. Didn't know really what I was doing there. But we somehow started talking about, well, if you were going to write reviews, what kind of reviews would you like to write? Or what, if you were going to write something for us, what do you think you might want to write about? But I walked out of there with having been hired to be the art columnist. And I think people were a bit skeptical, put it mildly.
In the office or in the world?
No, in the office.
I
Yeah,
see.
no one knew about it.
Yes.
Then I just started doing it and learned on the job, so to speak.
I wanted to ask, since part of that bridge includes having been written about, we met, I think, through many different people, one of whom was Janet Malcolm, who wrote a wonderful profile of you in The New Yorker. And did any of the writing about you that you liked or learned from have any effect or way of feeding you as a writer yourself?
Probably, although I can't really cite the example, but one thing that came out in the course of being interviewed by Janet over a period of years, and becoming a close friend of Janet's in the process, was something she writes about in her piece, the number of interviews that I gave over the years sort of astonished her, because she's someone, as you know, is terribly shy and would never submit to being interviewed at all. So she found it bizarre, but she didn't really understand that in the art world it's common practice for people to ask questions and then to be answered. But what I said to her at the time, which I semi-believed, is that doing interviews was a lazy person's way of writing, because I only had to do half the work, someone else would. But I did think of it as, wordplay in a positive, not simply answering the question, but trying to find some way of talking about something which interested me.
Yes.
Never satisfactorily, and it never really became that thing. So I think at a certain point I realized that if I were to want to do this in any way that was to more fully represent me as in terms of what I want to read, I had to do it myself.
I think it's a very interesting moment in this conversation to talk about the critics that were writing at the time, that your career started to grow as a painter, and there were people like Hilton Kramer and Gary Indiana.
That's quite a juxtaposition. Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And there were, in their way, I think, stylists
Right.
of a certain sort. And so how valuable was it to you to read these writers who a voice, really?
Well, that's my identity, if I can use that word, if I even have one as a writer, is as a stylist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not, and I have a kind of running dialogue with a very well-known critic in the art world who is a philosopher, who's very much a philosophical cast of mind, who's frequently objects to statements I make in some of the pieces because they're untidy, philosophically speaking, or they're maybe even indefensible, philosophically speaking. But I always have to remind him, I'm actually not a philosopher, I'm a stylist. And I'm only really interested in the aphoristic quality of how something can be encapsulated into a concise, almost a metaphor.
Yes.
That even just by the tone it points to a sensibility that's at work inside the art itself.
Right.
And it's just a different approach and really different desire. What I want to. It's what I want to feel.
Were there writers that you were reading of interest all along, no matter what the philosophical or stylistic bent?
Not so much in the art world, but certainly in the real literary world, so to speak. I do remember having a conversation with Peter Schjeldahl early on, who's a wonderful stylist and whose writing I've always admired and had great friendship with for a long time, asking him the same question, and his answer surprised me. It shouldn't have, but I was so ignorant. I didn't know much. Peter has always said the biggest influence on his style was Red Smith, the sports writer, sports columnist. So when I started to read Red Smith, I understood a little bit more about how a style is constructed, or what it's constructed out of. What is a style? A style is a way of showing what you think is important.
Right.
What choices you think are important to highlight.
It's what Marianne Moore called the radiograph of the soul. That it's sort of a frequency that you can't really analyze particularly, but I think that one of the things that I loved about the book and is made visual, there's visual reflectiveness that happens in each of the pieces. They're thought of, the artists are thought about, as opposed to coming at it the way that many critics do, which is with their eye in hand. Many of the pieces in the book are about artists that you've loved and learned from, and because of your passion or because of your deep feeling about them have made me go back and look and rethink. I'm just going to give you a couple of names because they are so reflective of your desire really to connect with other people, and that one person for sure is Alex Katz. Can we talk a bit about your writing about Alex?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I consciously try to do, and it's certainly helped me start a piece when I'm approaching something, is to really try to imagine how that person did it. I really try to put myself in their shoes, so to speak, even in the minute, boring details of where do they get the brushes and what kind of brushes they use and what kind of paint do they use, or if they don't use paint, what is it? Where do they find their material concerns? And I found for myself that, you can only do it to a certain extent, but trying to inhabit the working life of someone, the working day of someone, it's what allowed me to make the imaginative leap to be able to describe what is there. Anyone can describe it if you try, but I feel that asking myself the question, how did it get there? What steps did the person have to take in order to make that both imaginatively and materially is for me the starting point. So with Alex, what I'm trying to do is to highlight the painter's moment by moment concerns, how an image is made with a brush, which sounds so elementary as to be boring, but it's actually not, because what else is there?
Right.
I've talked at some points about Alex's sense of color. The color is very relational, so it allows me to talk about that, about the phenomenon of color as a whole investigation. I'm trying to come up with a way of describing the particular Katzian energy, or I think at one point I call it the Katzian life force. How to account for it? I think we can all feel it, but how do we account for it? Why do we feel it? So what I came up with was to discuss the how as opposed to the what.
Yes.
When, especially with a painting which is imagistic, or not just painting, but anything in the world that has images, the conversation tends to focus on what is being depicted, on the what, the subject matter. In talking about cats, I was able to focus on the how something is made, because cats is probably the premier example of how it's done is what makes it interesting.
Well, there's a wonderful moment in that essay where you describe with a particular relish and his clarity, and how he's just getting clearer and clearer as he advances in age, and that the mind doesn't get muddied. It's just his technique gets clearer, and the image becomes clearer, and he can take something that was uncharacteristic of him 40 years ago and make it his own. There's an amazing range in the book, from people like Alex Katz to Amy Silman to Christopher Wool. I loved all of the essays, but those three in particular, there was a feeling of that essential quality for art, for me anyway, which is mystery, that your language was really an examination of why do I feel this and how does it happen? It's a sort of marrying of two things.
Well, Chris is a good example, because his work is so utterly different from mine, and to try to project myself into his process was challenging. Also, for me, I had a history with his work which is not altogether congenial. I for years felt like I just simply didn't get it. I wasn't his audience. It wasn't for me. And I didn't have I didn't feel that I was under threat by it, the way one can feel about a work that you feel is not for you, can actually make you feel like you're under threat. I simply didn't know what it was. I didn't know what kind of animal it was. I knew that it was some kind of animal that I couldn't name, and it kind of bothered me that I couldn't name it. Years went by, and his work evolved. I had an epiphany, walking into a show of his at some point in the late 90s, and all of a sudden, the work spoke to me in a way that had eluded me for a long time. So that was interesting. What happened? What changed? How much did I change? Did the work change? Did the world around both of us change? So I wanted to try to get at those feelings.
Yes.
And then I describe in the piece about Chris in the book, coming upon him by chance, and so many things that I'm including in the essays and reaching for in the essays have an anecdotal quality, which is a little bit ironic, because for decades, I've rejected the anecdotal way of talking about art as simply too, I don't know what, too easy maybe. But the story is, the piece of anecdotal information is, there was a show of Courbet, a large Courbet retrospective at the Met, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And I remember running into Chris Wool at the Courbet show, thinking for an instant, in the way that one does when it's your unconscious mind talking, what's he doing here? Why would Christopher Wool be looking at Courbet, the last thing in the world? Then it dawned on me. The dying stag paintings that are so melodramatic and so, in a way, over the top emotionally. The Chris Wool's words are as much the dying stag as the dying stag, at least they are to him. And that experience of actually seeing him in the exhibition and realizing we were looking at the same painting and having very much the same experience of that painting helped me access that quality in his work.
Well, I mean, one of the fundamental reasons to write is to leave a record of some sort about the experience of feeling or thinking, and the records show in your book that you don't. I can't imagine you feeling kind of 50-50 about someone. Even when there's ambivalence, there's richness in the ambivalence. And when you started writing these pieces for Town and Country, were the kids learning something? I know, Gemma. Were they learning something for the first time, or were you getting comments back saying that they had never seen or thought in this way before?
You mean the readership of the magazine?
Well, Gemma, the editor.
Yeah.
And the readership of the magazine, for sure.
Well, it's true. Gemma is a literary person, not an art person.
She's great.
So oftentimes she didn't know who these people were, and so had to do some catch-up. We don't know I have no idea what the people in the magazine thought in between notices of weddings and horse shows and whatnot. They would read about Mike Kelly, but didn't seem to do anyone any harm.
There's, you came of age as an artist during the sort of tail end of the influence of Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, and I think Art and Culture is one of the most boring books I've ever read in my life, and it took me 4 years to finish it, but I did it. And, and I wonder if the energy that I see in your writing has something to do with the reaction to what criticism was supposed to be for a long time.
Well, of course, not just what it was supposed to be, but what it became in our time as well. It's interesting that you bring up Greenberg, because the role model, my role model for what I'm trying to do for the book overall, is the critic Fairfield Porter, who, as you know, was also a painter, very, very accomplished realist painter. Some people have a very high opinion of his work. I mean, he was one of the favorite painters of de Kooning, for example.
Yes.
Fairfield Porter was a very well-educated guy, very kind of patrician family. I'd gone to Harvard, so they did philosophy with George Santayana.
A lover of James Schuyler, but
exactly
lived with his family and children.
Had a very complicated family life involving Jimmy Schuyler.
Yes.
There was a moment when, at the height of Greenberg's authorial and even, let's say, dictatorial control of a certain segment of the art world, there was a moment at a party when Porter, listening to Clement Greenberg go on and on, said to himself, "Hey, wait a minute! My opinions are as good as his. And I'm actually better educated than he is. I should write my own opinions." And he did. So that story, I guess, kind of emboldened me to, if he could do it, maybe I could try also.
I think you've done more than try.
Well,
I think you've been very successful at it, and I, just because I'm a greedy person, would you read some of it yourself?
Well, I will, thank you.
Please.
Let's see. If you all don't know Fairfield Porter's writing, I would encourage you all to read it. It's collected in a book called Art in Its Own Terms. Well, this is probably a good place to start, considering the venue. On the work of Jeff Koons. Oh, also, I think I should say something, that some people have raised an eyebrow or two that over the fact that so many of the essays are about people who I know well, and in some cases, in most cases, actually quite close friends with. I don't know why that should be odd, but...
Well, that's a
Anyway,
martini conversation.
All right, we won't
yeah.
go. We'll save that for after.
Yes.
So, but on the work of Jeff Koons, if abstract painting expresses the idea, you are what you do, and pop art expresses the idea, you are what you like, then Koons's art says you are what other people like. on John Baldessari. For a very long time, John Baldessari had the distinction of being the tallest artist in the world. To paraphrase A.J. Liebling, John was taller than anyone better, and better than anyone taller. As was inevitable, Baldessari's hegemony in the height department has now been challenged by a handful of younger artists. What, is there to be no progress? Paul Pfeiffer, Richard Phillips, and certainly Mark Bradford have approached and possibly even surpassed Baldessari's measure. If it is true that these artists can see farther than their fellows, it is only because they have stood on the shoulders of giants such as Baldessari himself, which, in Bradford's case, would make him nearly 13 feet tall. So I don't think there's anything wrong with using humor when it's called for.
I think it's essential
On
to everything. Yes.
On Jack Goldstein's films. It's like walking through dried leaves on a chilly fall day. You keep your hands in your pockets, kicking leaves into the gutter, all the while hoping someone will see and feel sorry for you. The self-consciousness of the act doesn't necessarily diminish its poetry. There is also a range of pieces in the book. They're not all about my friends or even living artists. On the work of André Derain, an artist who interests me a lot. Continuity is the dialogue a painter carries on with himself in the guise of his precursors. It's what stays behind after the novelty burns down. On Albert Oehlen, who's in the collection here. Albert Oehlen is a terrific painter who flirts with disaster and gets away with it. He makes all kinds of rookie mistakes, but the paintings don't suffer. His work is full of undifferentiated bits of stuff, brush marks, splashes of paint, images, patterns, splayed all over the place with no focal point and too many similar-sized shapes. But the paintings work anyway. His surfaces are often slack, diffused, or awkward, but the paintings work anyway. His color is often muddy, soupy, and pleasant. Well, what the hell, you get the idea. On Mike Kelly, you brought up Mike Kelly earlier. It's hard to love an artist whose primary emotional register is shame. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Mike Kelly managed during his lifetime to attract a big top full of cultish, fervent partisans that included disaffected intellectuals and Park Avenue matrons. The lecturers joined hands with the lectured to. He was loved protectively, the way one loves a brilliant but unsocialized child, which is fitting considering that the central theme of his art is the emotional brutality and false cheer of American adolescence. Childhood as merely the introduction to a larger con. On Thomas Houseago, style reflects character. It's the aggregate of choices one has made, consciously or not, regarding art that came before. Should I keep going?
One more.
Okay, one more.
Yeah.
On group shows.
Uh-oh.
A group show is like any party. There are the people you want to spend time with and the bores you can't wait to get away from.
This is great. I think we have a few minutes for a few questions from the audience. Don't be shy, because we're all shy. Hello.
Or be shy, that's all right.
It's nice to be here in the room. Thank you.
Oh,
I find the title of your book to be very provocative.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering if you could talk about it.
Why is it provocative?
Well, I'm used to having dialogues with people who challenge my feelings about art and how beauty and all the mystical feelings that go into it are so important.
Uh-huh.
And when you say how to see,
Uh-huh.
you're assuming all sorts of things about yourself and about the people who are going to be reading it, and it assumes a lot. It's provocative.
It does assume a lot, you're right. Why not assume a lot? It's not easy to title a book. It was a placeholder title. I mean, there are two answers to the question. One is, it was a placeholder title and I never came up with a better one.
I think it's a great title.
Oh, thanks. Well, I never actually thought that the publisher would let it stand, that this is egregiously egotistical, and so on and so forth. And everyone said, no, it's actually great. So, but that's, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It is meant to be an invitation to the reader to approach art in that almost that flat-footed way. What do you see?
right.
Or this is what I see, this is how I see. You can maybe think about how you would do it.
Mm.
So that seeing, I am deliberately privileging the visual experience as the key to whatever it is that this thing is that we call art, and how that is, in a way, all you really need to know is what is it that you're seeing. That includes all the other complex experiences that people have talked about. Does that make sense?
Well, so it feels like that sort of definitive statement that's not really definitive. You know, when you, not you, but the title, when you say something like how to write, or how I write, or how to paint, or the creative habit and how to get it, Twyla Tharp's wonderful book.
Yeah.
They're statements that are really meant to be questioned.
Right.
And so instead of the question mark, which puts the book at a disadvantage, which I would have done, do I see? But to make it a definitive question is also to open it up
Yeah.
to a wider conversation, I think.
Right.
The egotistical question is always the one that I think, as artists, we're asked to answer into, and I hate putting them on that level, but I find that we're asked to defend ourselves against the egotistical, and saying, no, it's really over.
Well, I mean, egotistical is inaccurate. It's let's say call it personal.
Yeah.
Who is doing the seeing? We are. You are. I am.
Right.
Who else is doing it for? No one's doing it for us. We're seeing. It's also kind of funny to call a book about art, give a book about art a how-to title. I think it probably was not even clearly conscious nod to John Baldessari. I think it's the kind of title John would have liked. You know, how-to is already funny, and it's kind of disarmingly, straightforward. Yeah.
Sort of that Ray Johnson thing, how to make a rabbit, or how to.
Exactly how to make
I
a
think
rabbit.
I think it's much more in that realm. Yes, sir.
I couldn't entirely hear you. Can you say it louder, please?
The book is an artist, if I understood you correctly, you're talking about certain untidiness in artists being a stylist. And the book sounds very philosophical. It sounds like it has a philosophy or a bent and a vantage point and a tidiness to it. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know.
No, I disagree. I don't think that there's a tidiness to it. Otherwise, I wouldn't like it. But I understand what you're saying. I'm just never really attracted to
Well,
things that it has an arc for sure. But I don't really think It doesn't have a beginning, except for the introduction telling us how he becomes a writer. There's no real sort of conclusion and there's no real beginning. He just begins with this feeling and looking.
Well,
So,
it has a point of view.
no, I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that he doesn't. Is it that? And I'm saying it's not that. Oh, it's good. You can buy it. It's on sale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 years or less.
Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about the artists that influenced you in the early days and the artists that you admire today.
The artist who influenced me as an artist. Oh God, there's so many. It's a very long list. I don't even know where to start. Manet, Degas, people like that. Jasper Johns. That's some sort of synchronicity there.
It's hard because your brain goes somewhere else.
I really probably identify more with late 19th century French modernism than any other period in art history, but all of it is in there somehow. I do think that the older one gets, that continuity is what seems to matter most. That being said, there are so many hundreds of isolated artists who speak to one for certain reasons at certain times. And the other part of your question, I'm also going to duck, because there are so many artists working today who interest me. Again, it'll be a very, very long list, but so many for so many different reasons. My regret is that I just simply haven't had time to write about only more than a tiny fraction of the artists who I would like to write about, who really interest me deeply. It's a great time to be looking at art right now. There's a tremendous amount of talent.
Yes, sir.
Do you use the how-to of your painting in writing?
Do I?
Do you use the how-to paint? Do you use that, structure in your writing, in a sense? That style, sort of?
How to paint.
I think.
Do you understand?
I do. I think he means. Tell me if I'm wrong, but the many layers in David's paintings, many images connecting.
Yes.
So, are you writing in a collage style?
I say at one point, I think in the introduction, that for an artist to write about other artists is inevitably to write about oneself at the same time, at least in some way. And I think I said that collectively, the pieces do form a kind of portrait of a certain time when this collapsing dominant phenomena had to be addressed, each in their own way, each artist in their own way. Writing about other artists has made me acutely aware of the things about my own work that I'm unhappy with, I'm dissatisfied with. That's been kind of challenging.
And just one more. Yes,
Rachel.
please.
Do you think you've seen over the course of your life as an artist a sort of shift in terms of how frank artists are willing to be about one another's work?
Good question. Certainly the opening story that I told about artists openly insulting each other in a
Yes.
bar, it's hard to imagine that happening today, although I don't really know. But my sense of it is that would not occur.
No.
I'm not
The
sure
dealers
why.
do it to each other.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think artists talk any less ill about each other behind their backs, but that's not the same thing. I do think the stakes have changed in some way, which has cast an inhibition over everyone and the ability to say something contrarian, of a contrarian nature. There's one of the pieces in the book, it's actually a commencement address. I talk about a book that Eric Fischl wrote. Eric Fischl wrote a memoir, which we don't need to get into, but one of the things that he does in the memoir is to go out on a limb and criticize other artists whose work he just simply doesn't like. That doesn't speak, not only does not speak to him, he really doesn't
want it to speak to anyone.
He doesn't want to hear it, right?
Although I don't agree with
No.
his opinions, I applaud the fact that he said it, because it's important to be able to say, to use that wonderful phrase of Janet Malcolm's, it does no such thing.
Yes.
Because Janet Malcolm has used that as a kind of speaking truth to power.
Yes.
We all have had the experience, not just in the art world, but in the world, of someone representing a reality to us in a way which we know isn't right. We know it doesn't actually line up with our own experience. How much you're willing to resist that or try to change that, I think, is important to note. And what's really sort of, I mean, not to be too grand about it, it's one of the motivations behind the thing in the first place, the book in the first place. It's important to me to be able to say, it does no such thing. We hear so many insupportable claims made for contemporary art all the time that it has, in my view, has really muddied the water. And I do think it's important to be able to say, it does no such thing. It does this. It might do all these things, but it doesn't do that thing, and try to separate them out.
I'm grateful to you for doing it, David.
Thank you, Hilton.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
you.
coming.
Thank you, Hilton, and thank you, David. And thank you all for coming tonight. If you'd like to speak with David or have him sign the copy of your
Not
book,
speak, but sign.
please do so right outside the Oculus Hall. And we look forward to seeing you at our next On Private Collection talk.